오늘 강의의 주제는 근육 단백질 합성의 핵심인자인 식이 필수 아미노산과 근육 및 대사 건강에 관련된 내용으로 진행하도록 하겠습니다. 울프 교수님은 안정성 동위원소 추적제 기법 활용, 인체 대사 연구와 단백질 아미노산 영양 대사 부분의 세계적인 석학이십니다. 울프 교수님은 노인, 스포츠, 당뇨, 고지혈증, 신부전, 암, 근감소증 등과 같은 다양한 질환 상태와 관련하여 단백질과 필수 아미노산 대사 부분에서 40년 이상의 연구 경력을 가지고 계시며 600편 이상의 세계적인 과학 논문을 출판하셨으며 대부분의 연구가 사람을 대상으로 한 임상 연구이십니다. 울프 교수님의 강의 주제는 근기능 강화제인 식이 필수 아미노산의 개발과 검증에 관하여입니다. 큰 박수로 울프 교수님 환영해 주시기 바랍니다.
Okay, so finally it's my turn. I learned how to say hello yesterday, but I didn't get as far in Korean as learning how to say it's now your turn. The talk I'm going to focus on today is really going to be a story of a journey from very basic science to the ultimate translation to clinical science. And along the way, hopefully explain both the rationale, the evidence, and the application of essential amino acids, and particularly related to the Maiokeoralife, but even in a more general sense, the role of free amino acids and essential amino acids in promoting muscle health. One of the things that's evolved in the application of these methodologies to actual use in the field is that a whole variety of attributes have been attributed to essential amino acids, and particularly to the Maiokeor formulation. And you might ask, how could that be? How can one formulation have so many various applications? And the reason is because muscle itself is a central metabolic organ of the body, so that by targeting muscle as the metabolic goal of our nutritional supplementation, we affect a whole variety of physiological things that are directly related to muscle mass and muscle strength. Of course, we know physical function is a direct consequence of our muscle strength, muscle mass, and so forth. But there are a whole number of other metabolic aspects of muscle control that we have to also consider. Muscle is the primary source of maintaining normal plasma amino acid levels. And when we are in a circumstance of not having eaten food, even just between meals or overnight, the requirement for amino acids persists. The tissues like the brain and the skin and intestinal organs need to have a continual supply of amino acids to enable their continued synthesis of proteins to maintain a mass. And if we think about the skin, for example, we couldn't go for 2 or 3 days of skin being broken down. It wouldn't be compatible with life. And so the breakdown of muscle protein provides the amino acids and regulates the plasma amino acid levels so well that even after 5 to 6 weeks of complete fasting, the blood levels of amino acids are still at a normal level. And that's all attributable to regulation of the balance between muscle protein synthesis and breakdown. Muscle is the primary metabolic site of the clearance of plasma glucose, so that in terms of things like diabetes or metabolic syndrome, hyperglycemia is not just a symptom of failure of the plasma glucose production to be regulated, but it's dependent on the metabolic activity of muscle to clear the plasma glucose. We'll see that cardiovascular health is directly related to muscle mass and function, as well as survival from a number of different serious diseases. Bone health is particularly relevant to older individuals as they lose muscle mass and strength, because the torque of muscle contraction and the force of that contraction on the muscle is critical in enabling and causing the muscle to the bone to continue to be regenerated and maintain strength and integrity. Neurotransmitter balance is particularly important with the free amino acids. The major neurotransmitters in the brain are dopamine and serotonin, and both of these are derived from essential amino acids in the blood. In the case of serotonin, it's the dopamine. The tryptophan is the precursor. In the case of dopamine, the tyrosine is the immediate precursor, which is in turn derived from phenylalanine metabolism, and that the balance between the dopamine and serotonin determines how much wakefulness or energy we have, and that's all related to their precursor availability in the blood, which is in fact the essential amino acids. And finally, energy metabolism is an important aspect of muscle metabolism, and we'll see why that is the case as well. But for the purpose of today's talk, I'm going to focus on physical function, but just realize that all of these other aspects of muscle metabolism are important, and that the targeting of muscle function with essential amino acids is not only for the purpose of physical function, but also for a whole variety of metabolic regulation. I'm going to start with studies using stable isotope tracers, and we'll see the format of how these studies were used, and discuss a little bit about how they're applied and what the validation of these methods are, and how well they actually can be extrapolated to actual clinical trials. So I'll initially discuss studies that we've done over the years with stable isotope tracers that are very acute, short-term studies. In this study, we can see muscle biopsy being taken, and you can see my favorite subject here. And she's still speaking to me, so it shows that even these methods are somewhat invasive, but not so much that the subject might still marry you. This slide, I know we have a real diversity of backgrounds, and I'd like to spend a little bit more time on this than normal, because it really is the underpinning of the whole basis of the amino acid nutrition. Muscle protein is in a constant state of breakdown and resynthesis. The breakdown contributes the amino acids to this intracellular pool, and that intracellular pool is what the amino acids are drawn from to synthesize new proteins. That we call this process protein turnover. In the case where the breakdown exceeds the rate of synthesis, then there will be a catabolic state or net loss of muscle protein. If the rate of synthesis exceeds the rate of breakdown, then we're in an anabolic state where there's a net gain of muscle protein. In addition to this cycling of amino acid within the cell, there are other possible fates of the amino acids. Oxidation is one, so certain amino acids can be oxidized once they're released into the intracellular compartment. So they're not available for incorporation into new protein. And the only way that the new protein can be produced when those amino acids are oxidized is transport in from the blood via the transporters that actively transport amino acids from the blood into the intracellular compartment. Conversely, if there's an excess of amino acids in the intracellular compartment relative to the demand for protein synthesis, the amino acids will be released into the blood. So if we consider the circumstance in fasting, where now we have no amino acids coming into the blood from digestion, the rate of entry of amino acids into the cell is inadequate to maintain the rate of synthesis to be equal to breakdown, with the net result that amino acids leave the muscle at an accelerated rate, and these amino acids that leave the muscle tissue go to other tissues in the body that can afford to be not producing protein. They can't afford to not be producing protein on a continual basis. So we could think of the muscle as actually a reservoir of the amino acids in the body, and the balance between synthesis and breakdown will determine whether the amino acids are taken up when amino acids have been ingested or released into the blood to maintain an availability of those amino acids to other tissues in the body. The other thing that I know that there's a lot of interest in muscle function in this group here, and in our focus on muscle metabolism. And it's important to understand that this process of muscle protein turnover has a couple of important physiological aspects. The muscle fibers that are broken down are not the best functioning muscle fibers. They are selected in the process of breakdown to be the ones with the cross bridges broken or other aspects of the fibers not working so well. And those are replenished by the synthesis of better functioning new fibers. So that this process of protein breakdown and protein synthesis, just the muscle protein turnover, serves to improve the muscle quality. And when we look at, for example, any sort of athletic training, a fundamental basis of improved muscle function in athletic training is the stimulation of this process of muscle protein turnover, which will be improving muscle quality without necessarily changing muscle strength. So when we see, for example, athletes that seem to look about the same, whether it's in season or not in season, then they start working out and they get back in shape, and the mass of the muscle hasn't changed much. What has changed is the rate of protein turnover, and that we're trying to always generate an increase in the rate of muscle protein turnover so that the quality of the muscle protein is improved. So the key to our whole investigation of muscle protein metabolism that led to ultimately the development of the nutritional supplement that we're here to talk about required being able to actually measure these processes. And my lab developed a methodology for the first time to measure all of these parameters: the rate of muscle protein synthesis, the rate of protein breakdown, as well as the rate of transport of amino acids from the blood into the intracellular compartment, the rate of efflux of amino acids into the blood, and finally the rate of oxidation. So that the stable isotope methodology that we saw in the previous slide is actually the heart of being able to understand the basic physiology of muscle protein. And I'm going to just be very brief, but discuss some key aspects of how we determined over the years that the amino acids play a key role in regulating the process of both breakdown and synthesis and the balance between these two processes. Just to show you that there's an actual mathematical calculation that goes into this, we infuse tracer and we measure blood going into the leg and out of the leg, and from the muscle biopsy in the muscle itself, and from that we're able to calculate all of these parameters: the rate of uptake of amino acid, the rate of disappearance into the muscle or muscle protein synthesis, the rate of protein breakdown, and the rate of efflux of amino acids into the venous blood. So this methodology has been crucial in enabling us to address the basic aspects of muscle protein metabolism. I'm only going to give one little slide here about methodology, but there's sort of two reasons for going into this. My research over the last 50 years has very much focused on developing new methodologies using stable isotope tracers to quantify metabolic reactions in humans. And the question is always, how do you know that the values you come up with are actually correct? Because it's a model. We wouldn't have to have a model. We wouldn't have to use tracers if we could directly measure something. And this is a model. And so how do we know that it's correct? And the most effective way is to compare that methodology with another circumstance, completely different set of assumptions, and determine if we get the same value in both cases. And in the case of this arteriovenous balance, which is what I was just describing, we had an interesting model to compare it with, because in fact, what really started the clinical application of amino acids was an investigation funded by NASA regarding astronauts in spaceflight that lose muscle at a very fast rate because of the lack of resistance in anything they do in space, and the lack of gravity causes them to lose body muscle mass and strength. And the ground-based model for the loss of muscle in spaceflight is complete bed rest. So these subjects were completely in bed rest for a month without ever getting out of the flat horizontal position. And the big advantage of that methodology, that approach, relative to our tracer methodology, is that we could compare the actual change in muscle mass that occurred over that month with the tracer method, which predicts that amount just on the very first day of bed rest. So when we look at the results of that, we see that the tracer predicted loss, and this is a study done just the first day of bed rest, and we predicted on what was lost on that first day, if we extended that to a total of a month, that we lose approximately 400 grams of muscle mass. This shows the actual loss of muscle mass, not significantly different, measured by the DEXA, where we actually measured the change in muscle mass. So that this was an important study validating the fact that our measurements of the muscle protein metabolism and the net gain that we make in just a very short period of time in one day, we're able to actually validate that if we had continued the study for a month, we'd get the exact same value as if we measure the muscle mass directly. Well, now I'm going to go through just a couple of basic slides, and I'll introduce this with understanding that these studies take place over maybe 40 years and include 24 clinical trials. So I'm just giving you kind of the highlights of the results here, but enough to get an idea of the way in which the amino acids affect muscle. And it's important to understand back when we first started this and realized that our studies were the first studies in human subjects related to muscle protein metabolism. But based on animal studies, there really was a consensus that there was no role of amino acids in controlling muscle protein synthesis and breakdown, and that there were molecular mechanisms that were involved, but that there were always plenty of amino acids available to promote muscle protein synthesis. And this is not, this was in this book here, which was really, at the time it was published in the late 1970s, considered the most authoritative source of information on protein metabolism. And so we started this whole process of understanding how amino acids regulate muscle protein metabolism with the initial bias that, in fact, amino acids have nothing to do with protein synthesis. This shows the first slide, the first study in which we actually measured the effect of amino acids on muscle protein synthesis. And we see in the basal state that the muscle protein synthesis is less than the rate of muscle protein breakdown. As I explained, this is part of the regulation of the plasma amino acid levels in the absence of dietary intake, and that there's a net loss of muscle protein or a catabolic state in the absence of amino acid intake. Then with a very controlled infusion of amino acids so that we know exactly how many amino acids and what amino acids are being made available to the muscle, we see a very highly significant increase in muscle protein synthesis to where now the muscle protein synthesis exceeds the rate of protein breakdown. So the most fundamental observation that I'll talk about today is illustrated here. We've done many, many different types of studies, permutations, but the basic point that we started all this work with, namely that amino acids don't affect muscle protein synthesis, is proven to be incorrect, and that, in fact, the muscle protein synthesis is stimulated very robustly by increased availability of amino acids. We can conclude from this, as well as a variety of other studies, that consumption of amino acids stimulates muscle protein synthesis. So what about the reverse? If you decrease availability of amino acids, that should decrease the rate of muscle protein synthesis if, in fact, the availability of amino acids is the primary regulator of muscle protein metabolism. But that's not so easy to actually do because, as I said, the amino acid levels are regulated so closely that even after 5 or 6 weeks of no food at all, the amino acid levels are still maintained at the same concentration. So what we did in this study was use hemodialysis, which cleanses the blood in patients that do not have adequate kidney function, and in process of doing that, lowers the amino acid availability. So if we look at the experimental protocol here, we had 2 groups, the dialysis alone and the dialysis replacing amino acids. So we have a basal state, first of all, where we measured protein synthesis in the basal state. And then in both groups, they got dialysis. And this is the total plasma amino acid concentration. And we can look at any of the amino acids and they follow the same pattern. And that is the amino acid concentration goes down. Then in the one group, we continued that for another 2 hours of dialysis alone. Whereas in the experimental group, we gave a reinfusion of amino acids at a rate sufficient to maintain the original basal concentration. So dialysis in both groups, in one group a low amino acid concentration, in the other group the basal concentration. And what we see is that the two groups here, in the one case we had the amino acid infusion and the other the basal. The basal say both groups, the protein synthesis drops when we drop the availability of amino acids. Only in the group that gets the amino acids reinfused does the protein synthesis return to the basal state. So we know from this that between these two studies that increasing the protein occurs when the availability of amino acids is increased, protein synthesis is decreased as well. So that clearly the availability of amino acids in the bloodstream have a very pronounced effect on both the increases and decreases in protein synthesis in the muscle. Now, most of you probably didn't go. I'm sure I did this on this. Well, so we've determined in the previous data that the availability of amino acids stimulates or inhibits the protein synthesis, but these studies included all the amino acids that you get in the diet. In the dietary protein, they're comprised of both non-essential and essential amino acids, and that's what we've given. The question, okay, well, we skipped one, but if we can keep going from here, it'll be good. The question that we next asked, and in fact, if you were quick with Dr. Kim's observation, you already got a preview of the results of this study because he flashed that by, but I think it won't hurt to reiterate it because he went pretty quickly. The idea here was to determine whether the non-essential amino acids are actually necessary to be ingested to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. The goal in the long run, and as we'll see, is to develop a nutritional supplement which has as minimal amount of mass, both in terms of weight as well as the effect, and then we can have maximal effectiveness. This originally came from the space flight, where every gram that's put on the space shuttle was crucial, so that the idea was to make a nutritional supplement that was much more effective than any existent one on a gram per gram basis. And we'll see it also becomes important in older individuals that are somewhat limited in their ability or desire to eat a large amount of dietary protein as a supplement to their normal diet. So the question was, do we really need to ingest the non-essential amino acids as part of the stimulation of muscle protein synthesis? And the experiment involved infusing free amino acids so that their free amino acids are not digested, they're absorbed directly. So 100% of what you give comes into the blood. And that's where we use the free amino acids here because we knew they exactly came into the blood. And a 40-gram balanced mixture of non-essentials and essentials in the exact profile of beef protein. And we compared that to the 18 grams of amino acids, of essential amino acids that are a component of this. So this 40 grams consisted of 18 grams of essential and 22 grams of non-essentials. It was repeated without the non-essentials. We just didn't include the non-essentials in the second time, and just the essentials were looked at. This shows the experimental design, and the first time they got all the blue columns. That's the amount of each individual amino acid that was given. This is the profile of beef protein, so high quality protein. The second says they had just the red lines, the amount of essential amino acids that they got without any of the non-essentials. And this shows the results, and that is that the essential amino acids plus the non-essential amino acids gives a very robust stimulation of the net gain of muscle protein. Synthesis is stimulated beyond the rate of protein breakdown. When the essential amino acids are given in the profile of the beef, we got the exact same response. When we give the non-essential amino acids on their own, no effect at all. So that dropping the non-essential amino acids out of this group had no negative effect. And here we see that, in fact, the non-essentials are really not necessary. So that we already now have one step forward in a very highly potent, effective a supplement, and that is we don't need to worry about the non-essential amino acids, and that advances our goal quite a bit, because most dietary proteins have more non-essentials than essentials, so that just from a starting point, we're eliminating more than half of the amino acids that are in a dietary protein. This is an interesting slide in terms of the dose response, and I think that it's consistent with your personal experiences, and that is that we get a dose response to different levels of amino acid intake, of essential intake. Again, this is in the same profile as the beef protein, but then it hits a plateau at about 15 to 18 grams, and beyond that isn't any more effective. So there are two take-home messages from this. As little as 3 grams, which is very small. Keep in mind that in the normal diet with dietary protein, the total requirement for essential amino acids is at least 20 grams of essential amino acids. Most people eat as much as 30 grams of essential amino acids in the context of their normal diet. And yet a dietary supplement of the free essential amino acids, as little as 3 grams, gives a robust stimulation of muscle protein synthesis. Of course, 6 gives more, and 18 gives more than that, but there's a limit. You can't just keep going on ad infinitum. There is a dose response which peaks out at about 15 to 18 grams. So we know now in this progression that I'm trying to develop here that we have the need only for essential amino acids, and that there also is an advantage to the free amino acids that they're 100% absorbed, whereas dietary proteins have to be digested, and they are absorbed to a varying extent. If we take a high-quality protein like whey protein, about 90% is absorbed. Some of the more low-quality proteins like wheat protein, for example, is as low as 40% of the protein is absorbed. But to make it fair, we're using the highest quality protein that we can come up with, and we see that the 15 grams of essential amino acids in the same exact profile as the whey protein, which has now essential amino acids and non-essential amino acids, that we have more than a doubling of the rate of protein synthesis, because this is due, first of all, to the fact that we have 15 grams of essentials. We haven't bothered with the non-essentials, and they're not necessary. And then it's even more than twice as much because this is completely absorbed, and this is not absorbed entirely. And as a rapid absorption, the concentration in the blood in this group goes up much higher, so that the roles that the plasma amino acids play as nutraceuticals to stimulate metabolic processes can be activated much more readily in this group, because the absorption is so much faster and complete than in the whey protein group, where digestion both limits the complete absorption, but also limits the speed at which it's digested. Well, I'm going to focus now on the challenge of minimizing sarcopenia through the diet, and maybe when I'm finished we can talk. I know that there's a lot of interest in athletics as well, and I think we have a lot of lessons that I can share there, but I'll focus today on the challenges of minimizing sarcopenia through the diet. There are 3 aspects that are really problematic in terms of doing anything, and I'm emphasizing that we want to avoid this situation. I'm not talking about treating this situation, which is possible, but I think it's very difficult when a person reaches this stage to nutritionally change their ability to function. What we are trying to do is avoid that, and so there are 3 things that we have to worry about. One is the change in dietary patterns that older individuals tend to have. Secondly, the metabolic aspect of muscle metabolism in elderly individuals, which we can call anabolic resistance. And the third point is the traditional meal replacements, so dietary substitutes rather than supplements. And I'll show specifically what I mean by all 3 of these statements. This shows, of course, this dietary information is taken from the United States database, but probably similar here. the experts recommend as much as 1.5 grams of protein per kilogram per day for elderly. The recommended dietary allowance, which doesn't have any data beyond the age of 18, but even at that, if we take that as the requirement, we have as much as 50% of older individuals over 60 years old don't exceed the RDA for dietary protein. So there are a lot of reasons that, and of course, again, my experiences in the United States, but there are a lot of things that cause a decreased dietary protein intake, including costs, including cooking, the difficulty in chewing, and in particular in the United States, we are inundated with recommendations to avoid eating meat, which is really the best source of these essential amino acids. So that there are quite a few reasons why we see a decline in the total amount of dietary protein that's eaten. And there's also a very distinct change in protein sources. This study was just recently studied. In fact, when I made this slide, it hadn't yet been published. But this is a large study done in Europe, and this doesn't exactly coincide with the United States, and I doubt it does here as well. But the general point, I think all of those of you who deal with older individuals can understand the point. And that is when you look at young individuals and the older individuals, the most commonly consumed dietary protein sources. And in the case of the young individuals, we have poultry, fish, and meat. And the older, the crucial thing is bread becomes very common in older individuals in Europe. I don't know what the analogy would be here, but it's not a high quality protein. The important point to realize is that the meat is off the chart altogether. So older people do not tend to eat meat, and that's certainly true in the US as well, that the consumption of meat goes down, and that has a direct impact on the increase in the essential amino acids, because meat is a very high quality protein that's a great source of essential amino acids. So the natural dietary pattern of older individuals is a problem. Secondly, the metabolic response of muscle to the normal ingestion of essential amino acids is diminished. This is the anabolic resistance of muscle. This shows the response to 6.7 grams of essential amino acids, again, in the exact profile of the whey protein. So this is the exact same dose, the same profile of amino acids given to young individuals and to elderly. And what we see in terms of muscle protein synthesis, that the all with the same amount of amino acids, of essential amino acids in older individuals, less than half of the stimulation of muscle protein synthesis as in the young. So we can term this a lot of different things. Anabolic resistance is most commonly used. It reflects the metabolic flexibility of younger people, so that young, healthy people may think, I don't really need to worry about protein intake because whatever I eat is effectively converted into muscle protein, and that may be true to an extent. But one thing we know for sure is it's not true for older people, that if we have even a high quality profile of amino acids, that it does not stimulate muscle protein synthesis to the same extent. The third point is really an important point that is very underappreciated. In the United States, we have a very heavy reliance in older individuals on meal replacements. The most common in the US is called Ensure. There's also Boost. You must have similar beverages here, but those are the most common there. And they're mixtures of protein, carbohydrate, and fat that are meant to parallel a meal, and they're given to boost the nutritional intake of people, of older individuals, on the assumption that they're not really eating enough of a good diet. This is so commonly used in the US, for example, that in most hospitals in the US, for anybody in the hospital over the age of 65, they get a can of Ensure on their plate, on their tray for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. The problem with the meal replacement, this is a study done by Bill Evans and his associates, published in the New England Journal of Medicine, and what they showed was that in response to a 360 kilocal supplement, that the dietary intake was suppressed, of their normal diet was suppressed almost 300 kilocalories. So if we look at the total increase of kilocalories from a 360 kilocal supplement, it's only increased 50 kilocalories. So that whatever you provide with this full meal substitute is somehow then deleted out of the rest of their diet. So that the reason they're not eating enough is a change or downregulation in their dietary drive, and that to be successful, we have to overcome this response of the dietary supplement actually inhibiting the intake of the rest of the diet. So if we look at the key aspects from those three, addressing those three problems of how do we go about the developing of an effective nutritional supplement that would actually be used and accomplish the goal, first of all, it has to be low calorie so that there's not going to be a reduction in the rest of the dietary intake because you've taken a high calorie supplement. It has to be easily consumed. This is largely the reason that the dietary preferences change in older individuals, that some of the high quality proteins become much more difficult to consume. It needs to be highly effective because we know from the anabolic resistance that just normal nutrition is really not very effective. So it has to be highly effective in the anabolic resistant state. And importantly, it has to be superior to available products. And so these are the guiding principles that we have used to develop a product specifically for promoting muscle health in elderlies. So what we did as a starting place is to look at the mechanisms whereby essential amino acids initiate protein synthesis. And this is not just in young, but elderly and all individuals. And as a whole scheme, and don't worry, don't groan, because I'm not going to go through this in detail. I want to just point out that there's a whole series of molecular reactions that are involved in the initiation of protein synthesis. And this molecule here, mTOR, is at the center of the whole response. And that in vitro studies showed that leucine in particular, the essential amino acid leucine, is effective in activating this mTOR molecule. Other essential amino acids also have that effect, but the main amino acid that's received attention is the effect of leucine on activating this mTOR molecule, which then in turn activates all the downstream mechanisms involved in initiating protein synthesis. So the first place we looked at is why not just use leucine alone? Because this data shows here that leucine alone in vitro can activate mTOR, and with the mTOR activated can have at least a transient stimulation of protein synthesis. And in fact, what we see is that adding leucine to an in vitro model of muscle will give 100% increase in the activity as well as the phosphorylation of mTOR. So leucine alone can have a significant effect, and this is the basis for why there was a surge when these data became available and trying to use nutrition supplement of leucine alone to activate protein synthesis. Unfortunately, it didn't work. And the problem is that leucine alone doesn't stimulate muscle protein synthesis in humans. This is in older individuals where we get no increase in muscle protein synthesis at all with a large dose of leucine, which is sufficient to raise the concentration more than threefold. So that the leucine alone is not effective. If we had just 4.2 grams of the other essential amino acids plus that leucine, we get a robust stimulation of muscle protein synthesis, which is even greater when we add more of the other essential amino acids. So that leucine alone is not effective. You need all the essential amino acids. We did the same exact study with branched chain amino acids as well, leucine, valine, and isoleucine, and had no, in fact, actually in that model, they actually got worse. The protein synthesis actually went down. But if we understand how once initiated, the actual muscle protein is produced, then it becomes clear why leucine is key, because we do need to activate the process of protein synthesis, the initiation, but it's not effective alone.
Stop hiding.
This shows a schematic representation of how proteins are produced. The mRNA is transcribed from the DNA in the cell, and then has a code of three nucleotides each that corresponds to the transfer RNA that links up to an amino acid. And it's the amino acids are hooked together one at a time, and the next one up, in this case, the leucine's attached, then the next one's up as alanine, so the alanine has to be bound to a tRNA that will then be the next one up, the leucine, and so on. So when you get to the next one up, if it's not available in the intracellular space, that's the end of the line. And what has been partially produced is degraded, and there is no muscle protein synthesis. So the point is you have to have all of the amino acids, and ideally they should be available in proportion to their composition in muscle protein, so that we never have one specific amino acid that is limiting its availability to continue the chain of elongation. Well, what that study led to was the rationale that the best way we can increase the intracellular availability of amino acids in muscle is to give the amino acids in the profile of muscle protein, which is exactly what we did from the muscle biopsy. We measured the composition of the protein in the exact profile of the essential amino acids, and then gave that exact mixture. And unfortunately, it didn't really pan out because the concentrations that we increased in the intracellular compartment did not correspond very well to what we gave. So that the goal of having every amino acid available in proportion to its requirement for production of a new muscle protein was not achieved because the concentrations were not equally increased. And what we determined was that the count needed to be taken of the transport rates of individual amino acids into muscle, so that when you eat a dietary protein or have an amino acid supplement, those amino acids are actively transported into the muscle, and they're not equally effective. The transport mechanisms are not equally effective. We expanded the model I showed earlier, where we have the artery going to the muscle, to sample the interstitial fluid with dialysis, microdialysis, so that we're able to actually distinguish the active transport process from the interstitial fluid into muscle. And when we did this, we found a very distinct, and this doesn't show, one of the beauties of the stable isotope methodologies is we could do all the essential amino acids at the same time. This is just a representative sampling of few, which shows that the transport of phenylalanine is more than twice as fast, almost 3 times as fast as lysine, leucine somewhere in between. So that when we account for the transport rates of what we give, the optimal profile of the ingested group of essential amino acids is different than the composition in the muscle protein, but it successfully increases the intracellular concentrations in proportion to the requirement for those amino acids to produce muscle protein. We call that the profile of the amino acids, so that we account for these different transport rates and the profile of the amino acids, meaning the proportion of one amino acid to the other, so that we maximize the availability of the amino acids in the muscle to correspond to the actual requirement in the production of the muscle protein. And this, I'm going to spend a little more time on this than usual, because this is the most important slide of the day. The number one question I'm always asked is that there are so many formulations of essential amino acids. Why is MyoCare any different? Well, in fact, the first publication, there is certainly true that there are a lot of papers and formulations of essential amino acids. The initial idea and patent for giving an essential amino acid-based dietary supplement was I published that in the late 1990s. In 2006, there were basically no other clinical trials than in our lab. And between 2015 and the present, there have been over 120 clinical trials of essential amino acids. So that clearly there are a whole bunch of different formulations. But the important point here is that when we look at the formulation of free amino acids in whey protein, the highest known quality protein as far as stimulating muscle protein synthesis, that when we give the 6.7 in the profile that we call high leucine because it does have a higher percentage of leucine than in whey, but also accounts for the transport rates, we actually get more than a doubling in protein synthesis with the exact same amount of essential amino acids. So that it's not just the general concept of essential amino acids that's unique. It's the profile of those essential amino acids in relation to their requirement for production of muscle protein. So that when we compare the mixtures here, we're actually giving the exact same amount of the same amino acids in total. But in this case, we have a different profile of essential amino acids than in this case. And this profile of essential amino acids is superior to any other that has been described and is the basis for the patent. Well, what happens in anabolic resistance? And this, I like to show this because this is a study that Dr. Kim did when he was in Arkansas working with me. And this shows the comparison of the muscle response of individuals with heart failure to essential amino acids versus the Ensure Heart. And you can see both losing muscle protein in the fasted state, in the fed state, there's a response to Ensure Heart, but nowhere near as much as to the essential amino acids. So that we know that we actually have actually directly developed a formulation that's effective in anabolic resistance. So the question is, how does this actually translate to outcomes? And I'm going to just hit a few examples here. As I said, we've ourselves completed 24 clinical trials, and now there have been many others that have used our formulation and done clinical trials as well. But I'm going to show a few highlights to convince you that the stimulation of muscle protein synthesis that we measure with the acute measurement of stable isotope tracers measure of protein synthesis actually translate to changes over time. This shows the response in healthy elderly, given a dose of 7.5 of the EAAs in the twice a day for 3 months. And you can see that without any exercise program, the EAAs have stimulated muscle protein synthesis enough to have a significant increase in lean body mass, almost 1.5 kilogram increase in lean body mass. These are older individuals that we consider anabolic resistant. Not only do we see an increase in muscle mass, we see an increase in muscle strength, significant increase in both the Cybex measure of leg strength, grip strength, and other aspects of muscle strength. This shows a study of rehabilitation following hip surgery, which I was particularly interested in since I just had a hip replacement. And you can see why I was really drinking a lot of aminos after the hip surgery, because this shows the usual care, which includes aggressive physical therapy and 8 weeks of dietary counseling, and that with this rehab, they get back up to their pre-surgery strength. And of course, that pre-surgery strength is limited by the hip problem, but this shows that it's pretty good. But when we give the essential amino acids once a day, in this case, that the response is significantly greater, so that the recovery from orthopedic surgery is definitely amplified by taking essential amino acid. There's another study with knee replacement that shows the exact same thing. And I'll spend a little more time on this because this is a crucial study in relation to our attempt to have the FDA approve this as the first nutritional supplement comprised of amino acids that has FDA approval as a drug. And the reason that this is an important study is because one of the measures of physical function that we are using is the 6-minute walk, which most of the experts will tell you is not probably the most accurate measure of response, but it's the yardstick that the FDA uses just as required that to get a drug listing for sarcopenia approval, that it has to have a significant increase in the 6-minute walk. Other parameters are measured as well, but in this study, we measured the 6-minute walk in addition to other factors in low function elderly. Most had heart failure. Most had heart failure with preserved ejection fraction. There are a few that weren't clinically diagnosed, so that we can't really say that they all were. But fundamentally, these are individuals with heart failure with preserved ejection fraction. It involved 12 grams a day of Maicare for 12 weeks. The other groups had 15 grams of whey protein for 12 weeks, or standard care plus nutritional education. And you can see that we had a pretty good amount of subjects in this study. And this shows the effect. There's no physical activity or exercise. And keep in mind that these people really, a lot of them can't really do much exercise. They're very limited. What we see is that the whey protein does have some significant effect in the distance walked in the 6-minute walk case, but that the increase in the Maicare is greater, and in fact is the only one that reaches a level that is considered to be clinically significant. The education alone, I don't think this really means the education was bad, but these people were quite debilitated and actually were getting worse as from the beginning to the end of the intervention period. So that if we keep in mind that this is what's happening without treatment, that the increase in the 6-minute walk is even more dramatic. And in addition to this, we had significant increases in leg strength measured by Cyvax, as well as grip strength, and a variety of blood parameters that were improved, including decreased triglyceride concentration. And this is the last data slide I'll show, but I think it's a dramatic one. This shows a study in very similar individuals, 241 with an aggressive 12-week exercise program, where they got an increase in distance walk of about 50 meters, which is about exactly the same as what we've seen in the essential amino acids in the two. If we pool the two groups together, almost the exact same as exercise alone. So that we're really able to replicate the beneficial effect of exercise on the ability to perform physical activity. The current study that now is being undertaken in sponsored by the National Institutes of Health, being done in collaboration with us, but being actually done by cardiologists at the University of Pennsylvania Medical School and Wake Forest Medical School, who have been excited about our results and are applying the same formulation in a 4x4 design, where exercise alone, EAAs alone, and the combination of exercise and EAAs will be looked at in comparison to the placebo. And this is the next step that we're taking in order to follow the pathway outlined by the FDA that we need to accomplish to actually get FDA approval as a drug. So if we just summarize, this is the summary slide in which we look at the Maicare to boost muscle function. It's completely and rapidly digested, so it has no impact on the subsequent meal. It's easily consumed. It can be done in a very small volume. It's not possible to get the EAA profile with intact proteins. The profile, as I showed, makes a big difference in terms of how effective the mixture is. But you can't, a dietary protein, you're locked into whatever that profile is. You have no ability to change it. The EAA formulations exceed the effect of dietary proteins, and that it's very low calorie, and it's in the range of 40 to 50 kilocalories, which has no obligatory fat or carbohydrate components, and as a result has no impact on decreasing the rest of the dietary intake. It improves the metabolic state. In the first study I showed, the actual, they were insulin resistant, and that was actually improved with the EAA's formulation. And they can be used independently or combined with dietary protein to enhance the effect of dietary protein, so that so that there's a great flexibility here. And I think I'll stop here and hopefully we could have some discussion of areas that I haven't covered, because I know you're all probably really anxious to just have me finish and get the food. But they have a lot more data that I didn't present here. So if you have questions about other applications of it, we can be happy to discuss that.
울프 교수님의 훌륭한 강의 감사드립니다. 혹시